by the seaside. Hello, I'm Richard Harwood. I'm a barrister at 39 Essex Chambers.
And I'm Clarissa Levy, Art and Heritage Counsel at Wedlake Bell.
We are delighted to have with us Nick Laister to discuss the history and the future of seaside amusement parks. Nick is the Managing Director of Laister Planning and is a leading planning consultant dealing with visitor attractions and park homes. He also runs his own visitor attraction, which we'll come to later on. Hello, Nick.
Hello.
First of all, what do we mean by seaside amusement parks?
Well, I suppose what most people would call them these days is either a fun fair or even a theme park would be an expression commonly used these days. But at the seaside, they would be, I suppose in the planning definition, they would be an enclosed area of land that has fun fair rides and other side shows sort of around the edge. And in some ways, that has been largely unchanged, actually, for the last 100 years. The seaside amusement park, whether it's on land or on the decking of a pier, the concept of the seaside amusement park hasn't changed dramatically.
So what are the origins of the amusement parks?
I suppose amusement parks in general in this country would probably be traced back to, well, there's a number of sort of channels really that have merged to create the seaside amusement park. The first is the travelling fairs. Obviously, they go back many hundreds of years, travelling show people, initially running fairs that didn't include mechanical rides, which is the basis of an amusement park. But they often included sideshows and games, and they sort of developed over the years through the 16th, 17th, 18th century to start to include rides, and they were operated by travelling show people all around the country, but they tended to not go to the seaside. They tended to be in the main cities and towns or the main areas of population. What then happened is in the larger cities, there was a separate area of developments which probably ran in parallel to the travelling fairs, which were the pleasure gardens that started in the 1700s, possibly actually going back to the 1600s, but reached their peak in the 1800s before dying away. And these were probably the most famous one will be the Vauxhall Pleasure Gardens in London. These started out as a sort of pleasant, not dissimilar to a municipal park, but they usually had a paid entrance. You were offered a little bit more than a typical park, which would have included attractive gardens, places to sit, places to walk, and they were quite low key in the early days. As they developed, they started to bring in sideshows and band performances, firework displays. You know, they got a little bit more what they might call down market.
Populist.
Yeah, populist, that's the word, yeah. Even had the odd ride thrown in.
Yeah.
So that was a sort of parallel development. And then there would be the third element, I would say, would be the World's Fairs that were happening really started in the 1800s around the world, but also in Earl's Court, London, White City, etc., which started to bring in mechanical rides. So all that was happening. Of course, the seaside resorts, they really took shape with the arrival of the railways. So it was really in the late 1800s that these concepts started appearing at the seaside. And the question I'm often asked is, which is the oldest seaside amusement park? And it's possibly Margate or Blackpool. It's questionable which of those it is.
I can imagine a bit of north-south rivalry going on here. How does it sort of settle down that you've got the travelling show people who are moving around from site to site with their attractions and starting rides and all their caravans taking them during the summer season, to having permanent based attractions at the seaside? Are those related? Are the same people sometimes?
Essentially, they were. Yes, that's sort of how it happened. It happened, if I use the two examples I just mentioned, which were Margate in the south and Blackpool in the north. In Margate in the late 1800s, it was a show person that acquired an area of land on Margate seafront. It was actually planned to be a railway station, but unfortunately the operators built the station buildings before they actually got permission to put the railway lines into the station.
A common error, yeah.
Yeah, so they were left with a station building, but no trains coming to it. So that was opened as something called Hall by the Sea, and it was taken over by a show person, Lord George Sanger, and he acquired the land behind and created, I suppose, something like the pleasure gardens that I was mentioning, like the Vauxhall Pleasure Gardens, but included an element of rides, basic roundabouts, a lot of them people powered, but that was a sort of early origin of a show person. And similarly, at Blackpool, at a similar period, the late 1800s, sort of gypsies, travellers and show people started erecting roundabouts, again, a bit like at Margate, on the sands at the South Shore. But there, it was the development of what you might call a formal amusement park happened more quickly, in that an enterprising person called William Bean decided to sort of pull together all these areas, but operated by travelling show people, and create what was probably the first genuine enclosed amusement park. Although the history can't quite be traced back as far as Margate, it probably was the first enclosed amusement park where an operator acquired land, enclosed it, pulled everything together in one place, and gave it a name that eventually became the very famous Pleasure Beach.
Now, think of the amusement parks with big rides, roller coasters, and various other things designed to be scary, and so something which the travelling show people would have taken from site to site and have been hand-powered. So where did those big rides come from?
Yeah, so obviously the very, very early amusement parks at the Seaside were made up of the travelling rides. But yeah, the move towards the more permanent rides like the roller coasters, the sort of river caves, the water chutes, that was influenced by the development of Coney Island, really, that most of the ride types that found their way over to the UK seaside resorts started life at Coney Island. So the obvious and the most famous attraction would be the roller coaster. And that originated at Coney Island in 1884, when the original, what was called Switchback Railway. And it was only 1 year after the first Switchback Railway was opened at Coney Island that one opened in England at Skegness, one year later. And then those very, very basic rides, I mean, these literally were a few undulating hills. They were pushed by the ride operator onto the hills. And when they got to the far end, they would switch tracks, which is why they were called switchback, and then they would go back in the same direction. And so they're very, very basic rides. And that was then developed as the late 1800s moved forwards into what are called scenic railways. They are more substantial roller coasters, but again, they wouldn't be considered overly thrilling because in those days, the roller coasters didn't have any wheels under the track. So there was nothing to hold them onto the track. So what they had in those days, the scenic railways had a brakeman who would actually keep the roller coasters, the speed in check, basically. So scenic railways opened all over the UK as well, including in Margate and in Great Yarmouth. And those two scenic railways are still both operating to this day. But it wasn't until what are called the under friction wheels. They were developed by a chap called John Miller, and the first under-track wheel coaster opened in Blackpool in 1923. And really that technology of the early 1920s, that turned the gentle scenic railways into what we would now call a white knuckle ride, where the rides could do things a lot more daring. And if you ride the Big Dipper at Blackpool, which is still operating to this day, over 100 years later, it is still a very thrilling ride.
So we've got this American development of the technology, and how are the amusement parks sort of functioning pre-war? It sounds like a lot of development going on.
Yes, I think the biggest development in the large amusement parks would have happened between before the First World War, I would say, is when the big parks started to develop around the country. So obviously we have Blackpool, which probably traces back to about 1896. You've got Southend's amusement park, which is called the Kursaal, which opened in 1901. You've got Southport's Pleasureland from 1913, Morecambe Pleasure Park, 1909. Great Yarmouth, also 1909. So the big parks that would dominate those seaside resorts and become the largest amusement parks in the country for well over half a century, mainly developed in that period before the First World War. And they were boosted by the world's fairs, particularly the more recent ones in White City 1908 and Earl's Court in 1909. And that's where they would trial these big permanent rides of the types that you couldn't really take around the travelling fairs. So that included the large water chutes that were trialled on the Ferris wheels, and also the dark rides like the river caves and the Hiram Maxim flying machines, these types of rides, which were the sort of rides you couldn't assemble on a village green. And these rides would often be trialled at the World's Fair and then be moved to one of these large seaside parks.
So there can be a few up and downs in the story. I think we've done the rides, but there's then a fall in the seaside resorts and the amusement parks.
Because they're presumably responding to the number of holidaymakers that are available in the country to take seaside holidays. And the more and more of holidaymakers there are, then the more demand there's going to be for fun fairs. And as people are going elsewhere, then there'll be less demand for British seaside resorts.
That's right. I think between the wars, the seaside amusement parks probably actually had their heyday. So I think there was a busy time. And then similarly, post the Second World War, I think that some of the big, more modern developments happened in the 1920s and 30s. So the really big roller coasters that were positioned in the parks around the coast of Great Britain were all built in the 1920s and 30s. So the big roller coasters at Blackpool, Great Yarmouth, Skegness, Southend, they were all built in that period, 1920s and 30s. So that was probably considered the boom time. After the war, I think there was still a very popular period for the seaside parks. And what tended to happen in that period is the really big parks were joined by lots of smaller parks. So that was the rise of some of the sort of what you might call these days chain parks. So Billy Butlin, for example, who built his holiday camps in the 1930s, his venture in the 1950s was to build amusement parks in many seaside resorts. So he was going very cleverly, looking at the seaside resorts that didn't have these really big parks like Southend, Blackpool, Margate, and putting in medium-sized parks, and they were a great success. So really, the amusement parks continued to be very exceptionally popular, really, until I would say the 1970s, really, when a decline did start. There was a number of reasons for that. One which probably happened sooner than probably people realised, that the decline of the big parks was not just a case of fewer people going to seaside resorts. There was a major accident in Battersea Fun Fair in London. There was a Big Dipper ride there, a wooden roller coaster, that had an accident in 1972 that unfortunately killed 5 children. And that ride, for a short period of time, it made people, I think it just made the sort of old-fashioned wooden roller coasters go out of fashion. So during that period, following 1972, that next 2 or 3 years, a lot of the wooden roller coasters around the seaside of Great Britain did close. So, for example, Barry Island, Southend, Seaburn, Cleethorpes, Felixstowe, Rhyl, Whitley Bay, they all lost their big wooden roller coasters. And the big wooden roller coasters were always the dominant feature of the parks. So the loss of those rides started a decline of seaside amusement parks. But there were 2 other reasons why they declined. The obvious one, I think that everybody knows, is the rise of the foreign holidays and the cheap package holidays from the late 70s onwards. That clearly had a significant effect on British seaside towns. But there was also another separate process that was happening. Possibly people weren't spotting this quite as clearly as the decline of the seaside resort, which was the rise of the inland, what we now call theme park, the pay one price entry theme park. So if you go to the 1970s, when these wooden roller coasters were being removed from seaside parks, they were really no major what you would call theme parks. There was Bellevue, a big amusement park in Manchester. There was obviously the Battersea Fun Fair, which was still struggling on in the 1970s, although it did close in the mid-1970s. There were also pleasure gardens at places like Drayton Manor, and also travelling fairground rides at Alton Towers, the historic house. But what happened in the very late 1970s, 1980, is that the concept of what you might call Disneyland-style theme park finally arrived in the UK. I mean, that process had started in 1955 in America with the opening of the original Disneyland park in California. And that really changed the way these sorts of sites operated, creating a sort of destination park where you would actually travel to the park to spend your day, as opposed to traveling to a seaside resort where you would do many things. And a quick trip to the fun fair was just part of a collection of things that were happening. So that was a massive change. From 1980, with the opening of the Alton Towers theme park, and then following that, Thorpe Park, Chessington World of Adventures, Drayton Manor turned into a theme park, and the growth of the theme park, that took its toll on a lot of the seaside parks. So that combination of factors meant that the closure of seaside amusement parks really started to happen from the 1990s onwards.
One of the parks you identified as the first, or potentially the first, is Margate. What's happened with Margate?
So Margate actually was one of the parks that were in the process of closing. We'd seen the closure of the amusement parks at Morecambe, Whitley Bay, Scarborough, Seaburn, briefly Southport and Rill. Now at Margate it was particularly special, which is Dreamland, because it actually had what was the oldest operating roller coaster surviving in the UK, which was the Scenic Railway that had been erected in 1920 and was still completely intact and operating. But it was clear to me, as somebody who's taken an interest in amusement parks, that park and the ride were looking a little bit insecure. So I decided to have a go and see if I could get the Scenic Railway listed. Now, this is back in 2001. I wrote to Historic England, I think it was English Heritage back in those days, and sent a report in to show how rare that roller coaster was and whether they would consider making it a listed building just because of its rarity, not just of the structure itself, but the fact how it's sitting in a historic amusement park and its relationship with the site. And the other listed building, there was another listed building on the site as well that was already listed, which was the Dreamland Cinema and Ballroom. They were already listed, but the park itself seemed to be on the road to closure. So I wrote to English Heritage. They did decide to list the Scenic Railway and gave it a grade 2 listing at the time. It has subsequently been upgraded to 2-star. That was 2001, 2002. So at that point, I thought that was my contribution really to amusement park heritage. I thought, well, I've got a roller coaster listed. That's the oldest and the most vulnerable in the country. So that's fantastic. Maybe that will save the park as well while it's happening. But it was then announced very shortly after, within a few months, that Dreamland was to close. So that's when I set up the Save Dreamland campaign, which wasn't really my idea. It was because what happened was when the park was announced to be closed, a lot of locals obviously searched on the internet, which was around in 2003, and they found my name because I'd only recently got the Scenic Railway listed. So I had quite a lot of emails from people in Margate saying, "You got the Scenic Railway listed, can you help us?" So I said, yes, I'll see what I can do. So I set up this fairly low-key campaign. I think it was December 2003 I did that. And before I knew it, we had 12,000 members within a space of a few months. And I started to realise that actually this is quite important to the people of Margate to try and protect not just the Scenic Railway, but the Dreamland Park and keep it intact. So that's really how the Save Dreamland campaign started.
Right. So what then happened?
Well, obviously I'm a planner. So the first thing I thought of was the local plan. So we initially started the campaign. I suggested that the council included a policy in the local plan which protected both Dreamland, the whole of the Dreamland site, and the Scenic Railway. The council disagreed with that. They put a policy in for it to be redeveloped for housing and retail. So we went to the public local plan inquiry, which we did with what became the Dreamland Trust. So actually, I should say the Save Dreamland campaign is how it started. From about 2006, we set up the Dreamland Trust and we sort of incorporated ourselves properly, had a sort of board of directors, all volunteers, so we could actually try and, rather than just campaign about it, try and actually do something about it. So we went to the local plan inquiry. It was us against the council, and the planning inspector went our way and said that Dreamland should be entirely protected. It's a rare site, and of course is the home to the Scenic Railway and the listed cinema, and it's also so central to the success of Margate as a seaside resort. It needs to be protected. So that happened. But of course, protection in the local plan does not mean that an owner won't come forward with proposals for something else. And that's exactly what the owners did. So it was taken on by a property developer. So the operator sold it to a property developer, and that property developer put forward plans for basically a housing development, but leaving the Scenic Railway in the middle as a sort of sculpture, because it was listed, leaving it as a sculpture. So we weren't entirely happy with that, I have to say. That was, I think, the idea of a wooden structure like that standing in the middle of a housing estate and being maintained for the future seemed to me to be highly unlikely. So we objected to that. We started to build a proposal for the site. We thought, well, okay, a developer has it, it's their land, they're entitled to put forward an application for it. So I fully respected that. But I thought we could see if we can get some support to an alternative idea, which is one where we retain the amusement park and we make it a celebration of amusement park history. So a sort of what we called at the time, I think we called it a heritage amusement park at the time, or amusement park of thrilling historic rides, I think is the name we often called it. Yeah. And we tried to build that whole concept together. What happened then in 2008 was there was an arson attack on the scenic railway. And that attack took away 25% of the scenic railway. The whole central part of it disappeared. But unfortunately, that included the station. But even worse, it included the workshops where all the trains, the original trains, which had beautifully carved dragons' heads, they were all lost in the fire. So all that was left were the sort of two ends of the ride where it turned around. And that made a massive difference. So suddenly everybody took note and realised that if we're not careful, there's going to be, there were similar things going on in Brighton, obviously, with Brighton Pier and the West Pier, and there's similar sort of situations elsewhere. So people started to think, well, we need to start getting behind this project. So we then started to put forward a more serious proposal with the help of Heritage. We started off with the government's Sea Change programme. They'd done a report on seaside resorts and how vulnerable seaside amusement parks were. So they were very much in that report supporting us. So we managed to get to our proposal £3.6 million from Sea Change, which was a real good start. At that point, that really started to open the door to us to get other funds. So I had meetings with the Princess Heritage Trust, with the Heritage Lottery Fund. They got behind it and gave us 3.5 million. We still didn't own the site, of course. That was a slight issue. So what I did, I brokered a deal with the landowners to say, why don't we try and reach a compromise? Because I'm not a real believer of riding roughshod over developers, because the best way to make things happen is to work with property developers, in my view. So we brokered a deal with the developers where we would take half the site and run this amusement park, and they would then redevelop the other half of the site. It seemed to me a reasonable compromise. It would generate funds as well. That's a good way of bringing the development forward. So that all seemed fine. Unfortunately, around about that time, there was a lot of, because we had so many people behind us, there was a feeling that this project needed to move. And there was a feeling amongst not so much the trust, but the people funding the trust, that it wasn't moving quick enough. And what happened at that point was that the Thanet District Council, the local council, bear in mind, this is the council that we were up against trying to get the site allocated in the local plan. They actually came out in support of the Dreamland Trust and actually decided to not only give us some money, which I think from memory initially, I think it was about £18 million. So, I mean, it was a huge amount of money. They also agreed to commence a compulsory purchase process of the site. And that's because they helped us trying to get the developers to move forward with this sort of half amusement park, half property development. The council couldn't really get sufficient movement on that project. So that's why they decided, let's go. So far from being on the opposite side of the public inquiry, as I was a few years before, I was then sitting side by side with the council at a CPO inquiry in 2012, which ran for several weeks, on the compulsory purchase of Dreamland. And that was successful. And the public inquiry resulted in the CPO moving forward. The inspector was very much convinced by our project. And our project was underpinned by a lot of good financial information, because we'd put together a business plan. I mean, obviously these funders like Heritage Lottery and the DCMS, they needed a good business plan. So we were helped by operators around the country at Southend, at Great Yarmouth, Littlehampton and Blackpool. We were given a lot of access to information so we could see how these parks actually operated, as opposed to what is said in public about them. So the realities of operating. So We had a pretty good business model, which the funders liked, but also the inspector did as well. And that was really to try and build on the model that's used by most seaside parks, which is a free entry park where the park can be a destination. So Dreamland could be a destination, but it also needed, and this is some strong advice we received from other operators, it also needed, no matter how good the rides were, no matter how good the offer was, that it must attract people who have just come for a day at the seaside and might want to do an hour or two in the amusement park. It can't be a destination type attraction because it can't be in Alton Towers with a closed gate. It just wouldn't work. So that was the basis of our business plan. That's the basis on which the CPO was successful. And I'm pleased to say that following that CPO inquiry in 2012, within 3 years, the park was open. We brought on Wayne Hemingway, who's got a lot of interest in seaside history and culture himself, to help us with the sort of branding and design of the park. And we also, jointly with the council, we helped set up sort of an operating company. And in fact, some of the staff from the Dreamland Trust, including our development director, they then transferred into the operating company, because the Dreamland Trust was never going to operate the park. What we were trying to do was get the funding together, get the park built, get it open, and hopefully we could get a commercial operator to run it. But the trust would remain active, making sure that all the benefits, everything that we'd told Heritage Lottery in terms of community, education, history, etc., that all those things were integral to the project. So we got there in 2015.
How did it go after that?
When it opened in 2015, that was actually the point I stepped down as the chairman. I mean, I'd done 12 years running that project, so I stepped down. So I was never as closely involved. What happened when it opened, I did have concerns actually at the time about how it was going to open, the operating company. I mean, at the end of the day, we wanted there to be an operating company. We wanted that to be a commercial company that wasn't controlled by the Dreamland Trust or indeed by Thanet District Council. As far as I'm concerned, there's very little, if you look at examples around the world, very, very few examples of councils or public sector operated amusement parks. There are some, but not many. So I was a believer in it being a commercial operation. That's exactly what it was going to be. So the commercial operators, they took the decision to depart from our business plan, and they operated it as a sort of Alton Towers, Legoland type attraction, which we did caution them about not necessarily being the best way to do it. That our business plan wasn't built on that, and that was the strong advice we had not to do it. But that's how it operated for the first few months. It's fair to say it didn't do particularly well financially. I think it did well in terms of people were very happy that it reopened and people liked what they saw, but it had a very high gate price, and that was a decision taken. And so unfortunately, that particular operating company went into administration, but their operating model was then changed and they were sort of bought out of administration, all came back to life, running as a free entry park where you can either buy individual ride tickets, or if you really want to treat it like Legoland, you can buy a wristband. So you can arrive when it opens, buy a wristband, and have free access on all the rides. So you get the best of both worlds. And the other good thing about having lots of people just coming in off the beach is there's lots of people to spend money in the food and beverage, the cafes, the ice cream parlours, etc. So it just creates a buzz and an excitement. And that's what seaside amusement parks are all about. They're not about a clinical theme park type experience. They're about noise, about your music, about the smells, the sounds, the fact that the rides are all sort of stacked on top of each other. If you go and stand in Blackpool Pleasure Beach, which is obviously the greatest example of a seaside amusement park in this country, it's just full of noise, excitement, and they've got such a great mixture of old historic rides and new rides, and they're constantly adding new rides and investing in new roller coasters, so it never stands still. And that's the excitement of an amusement park, of a seaside amusement park, and that's how they really need to operate. And that's what they achieved at Dreamland. But at Dreamland, they took a slightly different turn. We were thinking that there would also be significant events at the park, as there are at all amusement parks.
Concerts and so on.
Yeah, but at Dreamland, they put a stage up next to the Scenic Railway roller coaster called the Scenic Stage, and they have basically bands playing. It's like rock and pop music events there with many well-known stars performing, so household names. It is genuinely a major music venue now for the south of England. So what they now have is In the evenings, they'll have shows on with top performers, and in the day, the rides will be running. So the whole place has a real buzz about it. So it has taken a slight maybe turn to what we originally wanted, but they have kept the basic concept of the sort of heritage rides, the sort of free entry approach, the fact that you can buy wristbands if you want. With the bonus, you can now watch a show as well in the evening, and it's a great example. It's found its niche, I would say, Trina, which I'm delighted about.
I'm getting the sense that you love a roller coaster, do you personally?
Oh, yes, I don't mind the odd roller coaster. Yes, I'm a bit partial to that. My kids as well. So I could certainly say that my children have probably had more than their fair share of white knuckle rides.
We mentioned at the start you run your own visitor attraction. Do you want to tell us about that?
Yes, so in parallel with doing Dreamland and being a planning consultant, I was also developing my own visitor attraction, which literally did run in parallel with the whole Dreamland project. When I was working at the idea, buying the land, getting planning permission for it, getting the funding together, was for a farm attraction in Chipping Norton, which we called Fairy Tale Farm, which opened actually 2013. It did actually beat Dreamland. It got open 2 years before Dreamland. That's mainly because it was just me and I wasn't having to deal with lots of other parties, the council and all the funders. So it was a little bit easier, but it isn't an amusement park, I have to emphasise. The whole concept of Fairy Tale Farm is obviously in my day job as a planning consultant, working for lots of theme parks, visitor attractions, and I visit a lot of them with my own family. What I've noticed over the years is that whilst most visitor attractions do their best for disabled people, when you've got a family where one of your children is disabled, which I have, my eldest daughter is disabled. So when you've got a family, as I did, with 3 children who aren't disabled and one who is, you're sort of travelling around trying to find somewhere where all 4 of the children can enjoy a day out equally. And that often what happens is that and bear in mind that most people, I know a lot of people who've got disabled children, obviously we meet a lot of them, and most families who have a disabled child also have children who aren't disabled. So whilst there are a lot of places designed for disabled children, sort of centres for disabled children, that's not the same as a visitor attraction where you can go with the whole family. So it was almost a choice between going somewhere for my disabled daughter, which really the other 3 kids weren't part of, or going somewhere that was more aimed at the children who weren't disabled, whereas my daughter was on the sideline. So I thought, what about setting up a visitor attraction where everything would be based around the needs of children with disabilities, but it would be designed as a mainstream visitor attraction that the whole family could enjoy together. So essentially, it's a farm attraction. So it's got a mixture of adventure play, indoor and outdoor play, and animals with a fairy tale twist. Obviously, with the name Fairy Tale Farm, we've got lots of sort of fairy tale scenes, lots of things where you press buttons and things happen. Sort of themed play as well, such as Fairy Dell, where you go to the size of a fairy and you've got giant toadstools and giant blades of grass to walk around. So it's all very sort of, we try to be imaginative and immersive. But at the end of the day, it's a mainstream farm attraction. But the big difference is when anything we put in, we think, how can we make this as accessible to as many different children with as many different needs as we possibly can? Now, of course, there's no such thing as something being entirely accessible because, for example, most disabled people don't have wheelchairs. So, and ironically, we had a survey done by an accessibility consultant of Fairy Tale Farm, and one of our attractions that we had when we were opening was a wheelchair swing. And we lost points for having a wheelchair swing on accessibility because it's not inclusive. It's not accessible to most people. So I still stood my ground and we still developed the site with a wheelchair swing, but it just sort of illustrates the point that it is very hard to make something accessible to everybody. But we do our best with sensory, with sounds, with colours, with things that you could touch, things that move, play that's as accessible as possible. And obviously the animals.
Alpacas are always the answer.
Yeah, we've got alpacas and they are extremely popular, I'd say. I think what a lot of our children with special needs really like are the alpacas. They also like, I think, the guinea pigs and the rabbits because they can hold them and touch them and feel them, and they can have a really close relationship for a few minutes with an animal, which maybe you don't quite get with some of the bigger ones.
You don't grow out of this. My 19-year-old son is coming with me to visit some alpacas for his birthday. Literally true.
A great choice, yes. And my eldest daughter's now 27 and she still loves them. I mean, she's got cerebral palsy. She's in a wheelchair, but she still loves the alpacas and she still loves Fairy Tale Farm, which is in her back garden, really. It's just next door. It's not far from our house, so she can get in there quite easily and have a bit of fun.
Nick, thank you so much for telling us not just about amusement parks, but about two spectacular achievements. And thank you so much.
No problem.
Thank you for listening to the Art and Heritage Law Contested Heritage. Please do follow or subscribe on Apple or Spotify podcasts to enjoy more shows.
We have a new podcast out every fortnight. If you're able, please take the time to rate us and put down a review.
The show is also on the 39 Essex Chambers website, along with podcast series on topics such as artificial intelligence, climate change and planning.